2 brothers walked out onto the frozen lake that morning. Only one walked back. I told him my dog, Kaiser, was too old to join us, but that was a lie. The truth was, I couldn't let the only creature who loved me witness the sin I was about to commit. That morning on the ice, I didn't just silence a traitor. I killed the last part of my own soul. The winter of 1984 in Montana was unforgiving. Outside the heavy log walls of the Thorne estate, a blizzard raged, burying the world in white silence. Inside, the great room was warm, lit only by the dying embers of a massive stone fireplace. Elias Thorne sat in a high-backed leather armchair, a book resting forgotten in his lap. He was lost in thought, listening to the wind battering the timber beams. The isolation of the mountains usually brought him peace, but tonight the air felt heavy with an unspoken threat. At his feet lay Kaiser. The German shepherd breathed with a slow, rhythmic rasp, his old joints aching in the cold. The dog was deeply asleep, twitching occasionally in a dream. Usually the night was filled with the subtle, reassuring sounds of the security detail patrolling the perimeter. The crunch of boots on snow, the low murmur of radios, the faint mechanical hum of the generator. Suddenly, Kaiser's eyes snapped open. The old dog did not bark, he did not growl, he simply stood up, his movements stiff but urgent. The hackles along his spine stood rigid. He began to pace in a tight circle around Elias's chair, his ears swiveling back and forth, straining against the howling wind outside. Elias watched him, his hand instinctively drifting toward the drawer where he kept his revolver. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Kaiser stopped. He pressed his wet nose hard against Elias's hand, then looked toward the large plate-glass window that overlooked the valley. The dog's body was trembling, not from cold, but from a primal realization. The familiar sense of the 4 guards who patrolled the deck were gone. The rhythmic crunch of their boots had ceased. The silence outside was absolute. Elias understood. Kaiser was not alerting him to a presence. He was alerting him to an absence. The perimeter had been breached. Without a second of hesitation, Elias threw himself sideways, rolling off the leather armchair onto the hardwood floor. At that exact instant, a deafening crack tore through the room. The large window shattered inward, spraying shards of glass across the rug. A high-caliber sniper bullet buried itself deep into the headrest of the chair where Elias's head had been split seconds before. Leather exploded into the air. "Get down!" Elias hissed, though the dog was already moving. Elias scrambled on his elbows and knees toward the shadow of the hallway, keeping his head low. Kaiser did not run ahead to safety. Instead, the old dog positioned himself between the shattered window and his master, moving backward, using his own body as a shield against any follow-up shots. They retreated into the darkness of the inner corridor, leaving the wind to howl through the broken window behind them. The blizzard had subsided by dawn, leaving the Thorne estate encased in a tomb of ice. The shattered window in the great room had been boarded up with plywood, a temporary scar on the face of the mansion. Inside the library, the air was thick with suspicion. Elias stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. He had summoned the inner circle of the family for an emergency meeting. He needed to look into their eyes. He needed to know who had sold him out. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Julian Thorne rushed in. Julian was Elias's younger half-brother. At 40 years old, he bore a faint resemblance to Elias, sharing the same dark hair, though Julian's was thinning and kept fastidiously combed. He was a man of softer features and nervous energy, wearing a cashmere coat that looked too pristine for the rugged Montana winter. Julian had always lived in Elias's shadow, managing the family's finances while Elias managed the war. "My God, Elias," Julian gasped, his breath coming in short, panicked puffs. "I heard about the shooter. Are you hurt? Tell me you are all right." Julian hurried across the Persian rug, his arms outstretched to embrace his brother. His face was a mask of frantic concern, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for invisible threats. Lying on his rug near the hearth, Kaiser lifted his head. For 9 years, Kaiser had known Julian. The dog usually greeted the younger Thorne with a wagging tail and a friendly nudge. But today, as Julian approached, Kaiser did not wag his tail. Instead, the old German shepherd struggled to his feet with a groan of effort. He stepped between Elias and Julian, planting his paws firmly on the floor. As Julian reached out, Kaiser lowered his head. A low, vibrating growl rumbled deep within the dog's chest, a sound like grinding stones. Julian froze, his hands hovering in midair. "What is wrong with him?" Julian asked, his voice trembling. "It is me, Kaiser, it is Julian." He tried to step forward again, but Kaiser snapped his jaws, baring his yellowed teeth in a clear warning. The dog backed away slightly, his nose twitching violently as he inhaled the air around Julian's coat. Elias watched the interaction with cold, analytical eyes. He saw Kaiser's nostrils flare. The dog was picking up a scent that was alien to this house. It was a smell Elias knew well, though Julian did not smoke. It was the heavy, cloying aroma of expensive Cuban cigars, the specific brand favored by Sterling, their rival in the mining business. Mixed with the tobacco was another scent, one that an animal could detect instantly, the sharp, acidic tang of cold sweat and pure terror. Julian hated smoke. He claimed to be allergic to it. Yet here he was, reeking of the enemy's vice. Elias looked up from the dog to his brother. He saw Julian's eyes dart away, unable to hold his gaze. "The dog is just shaken from the attack," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Go get a drink, Julian. You look like you have seen a ghost." As Julian hurried toward the liquor cabinet, wiping his brow, Elias rested his hand on Kaiser's head. The dog leaned into him, still watching Julian with unblinking suspicion. The traitor had walked into the room, and he had brought the scent of his guilt with him. The private ski lodge sat high in the Bitterroot Mountains, isolated by miles of snow-covered pines. It was a place Elias utilized for delicate negotiations, far from the prying eyes of the city. On this night, the grand timber-framed bar was deserted, save for the two brothers and the old dog lying near the hearth. Outside, the wind howled against the reinforced glass, but inside, the air was heavy with the smell of expensive scotch and unspoken accusations. Elias poured another drink for his brother. Julian accepted it with a shaking hand, his face flushed from hours of consumption. The alcohol had stripped away his usual anxious veneer, revealing the bitter resentment that had festered beneath the surface for decades. Julian leaned over the mahogany counter, his speech slurring as he rambled about their father. He spoke of how Elias had always been the favorite, the strong one, the leader, while he was relegated to the role of a glorified accountant, a shadow in the background of the Thorne Empire. Elias listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He watched his brother unravel thread by thread, waiting for the moment of total vulnerability. "Come on, Julian," Elias said softly, setting his glass down. "It is late. Let us go up." He guided his stumbling brother out of the bar and into the small, brass-gated elevator that serviced the private suites. Kaiser followed them, his claws clicking slowly on the marble floor. The dog moved with a heavy reluctance, his head low. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing them in a small, quiet box of polished wood and mirrors. The mechanical hum of the lift rising was the only sound. Suddenly, Elias reached out. He did not strike his brother. Instead, he grabbed Julian by the shoulders, pulling him into a firm, almost suffocating embrace. It was a hold that mimicked affection, but possessed the crushing weight of a judgment. He held Julian there, feeling the smaller man stiffen in confusion. Elias pulled back just enough to look directly into Julian's watery, bloodshot eyes. The mask of the brother fell away, revealing the ruthless king beneath. "What did Sterling promise you, Julian?" Elias whispered, his voice calm and terrifyingly gentle. "Did he promise you freedom? Did he promise you a name of your own?" Julian gasped, the air vanishing from his lungs. He tried to pull away, but Elias held him fast. "I know it was you, Julian," Elias said. The confession did not come with words. It came with a collapse. Julian's knees gave way, and he slid down against the wall of the elevator, burying his face in his hands. He began to weep, ugly, jagged sobs that echoed in the confined space. He cried about jealousy, about being overlooked, about wanting just once to be the one in control. In the corner of the elevator, Kaiser turned his body away. The old German shepherd pressed his nose into the corner of the wall, his ears drooping flat against his skull. He let out a soft, high-pitched whine. The animal could sense the utter destruction of the bond between the two men, and for the first time in his life he could not bear to watch his master. The war with Sterling had shifted from the shadows of the forest to the bright fluorescent lights of the federal courtroom. Sterling had pulled strings in Washington, triggering a massive FBI investigation into the Thorne family business. The government's case rested entirely on the testimony of one man, the family's former accountant who had been taken into protective custody weeks prior. If he spoke, the empire Elias had built would crumble within days. Elias did not send lawyers to intimidate the witness. He did not order a hit on the safe house. Instead, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, he drove to the Whispering Pines nursing home on the outskirts of the city. He walked past the front desk with the confidence of a dutiful relative, Kaiser moving silently at his heel. They entered room 214. Inside sat an elderly man, frail and confined to a wheelchair, staring blankly out the window at the snow. This was the accountant's father, a man forgotten by the world, but cherished by his son. Elias sat in the visitor's chair. He pulled a red apple and a small pocket knife from his coat. The room was filled with the soft, rhythmic sound of the blade slicing through the fruit, peeling away the skin in one long, unbroken ribbon. Kaiser approached the wheelchair. The dog did not growl or show any aggression. Instead, he gently placed his heavy head on the old man's thin, blanket-covered knees. The elderly man smiled, his trembling hand reaching down to stroke the dog's ears. "Such a good boy," the old man murmured, unaware of who sat before him or what the dog represented. Elias sliced a piece of apple and offered it to the man. It was a scene of perfect, peaceful domesticity. Before he left, Elias snapped a single photograph of the scene. The old man smiling, the loyal dog resting affectionately on his lap, and the peeled apple on the table. The next morning, just minutes before the grand jury was set to convene, the accountant received a sealed envelope. There was no note inside, no written threat. There was only the photograph. The message was deafening in its silence. It did not say we will hurt him. It said we are already there. It said we can touch the things you love and you cannot stop us. When the prosecutor called the accountant to the stand, the man was pale and shaking. He looked at the jury, then at the empty gallery where he imagined Elias might be sitting. He broke down. He claimed his memory had failed him. He claimed he had been coerced by the agents. He refused to testify against the Thorne family. Without its key witness, the government's case collapsed before it even began. The investigation was dropped, and the Thorne empire remained untouched, protected not by violence, but by a terrifying demonstration of reach. The counterattack did not begin with a gunshot, but with the morning papers. Elias released the evidence he had been gathering for years, a deluge of financial records exposing Sterling's massive tax evasion and money laundering schemes. By noon, the federal agents were swarming the offices of the rival mining conglomerate. By evening, the empire that had threatened the Thorne family was in ruins. Desperate and facing a lifetime in prison, Sterling tried to run. The blizzard that night was blinding, a wall of white that erased the world. On the treacherous mountain pass that wound its way out of the valley, a single pair of headlights cut through the storm. Sterling drove with the reckless panic of a hunted man. From a high vantage point overlooking the pass, the scene unfolded in silence. The vehicle's lights swept erratically across the snow-covered pines as the car took the hairpin turns too fast. Then, at the sharpest bend, the lights did not turn. They continued straight, launching into the empty void of the canyon. There was no explosion, no cinematic crash. The lights simply tumbled downward, spinning through the darkness until they were swallowed by the abyss below. The snow continued to fall, quickly covering the tire tracks, erasing Sterling from the earth as if he had never existed. Back at the estate, the victory brought no celebration. The house was quiet, suffocated by the heavy atmosphere of pending tragedy. Down by the frozen lake, the old wooden boathouse stood isolated in the snow. Inside, Julian was being held, stripped of his luxury and his freedom, waiting for his brother's judgment. Elias sat alone in his study, the room plunged in shadow. A glass of amber whiskey sat untouched on the desk before him. He stared into the dark corners of the room, his mind replaying memories of childhood, of the brother he had protected, and the brother who had sold him for a promise of power. The weight of the decision he had to make pressed down on him, heavier than the timber beams of the roof. Kaiser lay on the rug beneath the desk. The old dog sensed the shift in the air. He did not sleep. Instead, he dragged his heavy body closer to Elias's chair. He rested his chin on Elias's boot, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. Occasionally, the dog would lick Elias's hanging hand, a gentle, wet rasp against the skin, offering the only comfort available in a house filled with ghosts. Elias looked down at the animal. Kaiser had signaled the danger. Kaiser had identified the traitor. And now Kaiser offered solace. But even the dog's loyalty could not change the laws of their world. A traitor could not live, even if he shared your blood. Elias finished the whiskey in one burning swallow and stood up. It was time. The dawn broke over the valley with a silence that felt heavy enough to crush the lungs. The lake was a vast white expanse, frozen solid under a blanket of thick gray fog that obscured the horizon. The world was stripped of color, reduced to shades of white, gray, and the dark charcoal of the pine trees lining the shore. Two figures walked out onto the ice, their boots crunching softly on the frozen surface. Elias walked with a grim, steady rhythm, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. Beside him walked Julian. The younger brother moved with the shuffling gait of a man walking toward a destination he did not wish to reach, yet had no choice but to find. They walked until the shore was nothing but a dark smudge behind them. The isolation was absolute. Julian stopped. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering in the biting cold. He looked around the empty white void, his eyes searching for a familiar comfort that was conspicuously absent. "Where is Kaiser?" Julian asked, his voice small and trembling in the vastness. Elias stopped and stared out into the fog. "He is old," Elias replied, his voice flat. "The cold bites too deep for his joints these days. He is waiting at the house." It was a mercy, and Julian knew it. Kaiser had been the only living thing that had looked at Julian without judgment, and Elias would not allow the dog to witness what was about to happen. Elias gestured toward the invisible horizon. "Do you remember, Julian? We used to fish right here when we were boys. Before the business, before the money. Look out there." Julian nodded, tears freezing on his cheeks. He turned his back to his brother and looked out into the white nothingness. Back on the shore, Kaiser sat at the edge of the tree line. The old German shepherd was a statue of silver and gray against the snow. His ears swiveled forward, straining to hear through the damp air. He sat with a rigid posture, his amber eyes fixed on the spot where the two men had vanished into the fog. Suddenly, a sound rolled across the ice. It was not the sharp, high-pitched crack of a gunshot that might startle a bird. It was a dull, heavy thud, a hollow sound like the deep fracturing of the ice itself. It was a sound of finality. On the shore, Kaiser flinched. A shudder ran through his heavy fur. He let out a low, mournful whine that was instantly swallowed by the mist. He did not bark. He simply lowered his head, pressing his chin into the snow. Minutes passed. The silence returned, heavier than before. Then a shape materialized from the white void. One figure. Elias walked back to the shore. He moved with a mechanical stiffness, his eyes fixed on the ground. He did not look back at the lake. He did not look for his brother. When he reached the tree line, Kaiser stood up slowly. The dog did not wag his tail. He did not look past Elias into the fog to see if anyone else was coming. He knew. Elias walked past the dog without a word, heading toward the large, empty house on the hill. Kaiser turned and fell in step behind his master. They walked together, a man and his dog, leaving two solitary sets of tracks in the snow, bound together by a secret that would remain buried beneath the ice forever. In the end, the silence of the frozen lake swallowed everything, leaving only the sound of faithful paws on the snow. Kaiser reminds us that in a world of shifting alliances, a dog's loyalty is the only truth we can hold on to. If this story touched your heart, please honor their bond by liking this video and subscribing to join our pack. The winter is far from over, so click the video appearing on your screen now to follow the trail into our next mystery.